Hi everyone, it's Jared here from Eaglerise Farm again. Thought I'd take the opportunity to share the presentation I did for the Australian Permaculture Convergence in April 2023. The title's Putting Permaculture Out to Pasture. And what I was trying to do in this presentation is demonstrate the importance of the permaculture principles in the overall design and management of our farm and how it impacts on our decision making. And one big way it did that was made us produce our own philosophies. So this is about the philosophies and the permaculture principles. For those that haven't followed us at all, I just thought I'd do a quick fly around of the farm to show you what we do. As we leave the farmhouse there, we you can see our food grassy woodland that we've been developing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. That's quite extensive. And then here we go over the vineyard that we're establishing. It's still pretty young at this stage. And over some the swale paddocks that our COVID backpackers installed when they were refuging from COVID here. There's our woodlot that we're over now that we planted a few times. It died because of drought. That was fairly severe. That was 20 years ago. As we go up our western boundary, you can see that how challenging the country is. Immediately to the right there is a white box red stringy bark community. But if you look across where you see the rocks, then the community, ecological community there is a tumble down gum casuarina community. So it's an interesting quirk of the geology of the farm. As we go across our northern boundary, we've come up 100 metres in elevation from our front gate. So you can start to see the patterns in the landscape where we've got gullies, ridges, gullies, ridges, gullies, ridges, and where we've got sloping country from the north sloping down to the south. So that's some primary patterns in their landscape that impacted on our design. Around about now, we're heading down, back down towards the house. We're 4 kilometres from the nearest power pole, so we established a completely off-grid property, and we built a straw bale house, and so that makes it really comfy and cosy. And so that's it in a nutshell, and you can see the view that we have to put up with at times. It's pretty good. What the presentation's really about is discussing our philosophies, and we're using a philosophy flower as a model to explain how they work. We used the permaculture principles, but we rewrote them, and I just considered really important to rewrite the principles. Everyone should write their own permaculture principles, because when you rewrite them in your own words, same principles basically, but in your own words, you take ownership of them. And when you take ownership of something like the principles, you're taking ownership on your decision making and how you're going to design your property and how you're going to manage it. It's to me, it's a really important lesson to learn. And what we're trying to do is look at the overall thought process of how we operate with our principles and philosophies. The first one we look at, and these aren't in any particular order, but the first one we look at is welfare outcomes precede economic outcomes. Now, I'll precede this by saying also that since I bought the farm in 2000, they had nothing on it, and I've been able to have full-time work, and so my full-time income has paid for the development of the farm, and that's taken the economic precedence away because we've been able to finance our farm work with my full-time work. So that's just an important thing. That's where these philosophies are about us. These are good for us. They're not necessarily good for you. I'd be very surprised if anyone agrees with all our philosophies. I'd be disappointed if everyone believed in all of them, because these are individual, and so that's why you write your own. So this first one, we look at all types of welfare before economic welfare. But my main passion probably is the ecological welfare. So a lot of the decision making, and you'll see this throughout the philosophies, it's all ecological thinking, and that takes precedence over making money. So I figured that you have to look after the ecosystem and get the ecosystem running right before you start making money. If you start being influenced by economic outcomes, then you will be doing shortcuts on the ecological outcomes and some of the others as well. An example of what we've done here is a little tractor. It's only a 35 horsepower tractor, and it does pretty much exactly what it has to do. Every now and then there's it's just underpowered, but most of the time it's quite good, and it doesn't actually use much fuel at all. So it's really handy like that. Uh, Pork on the run is another way that we use to describe our pork production. We don't pen them up. We don't keep them behind electronetting as such, but we only do pork when we have surplus food. So we actually grow surplus eggs, surplus veggies to feed our pigs. And then when that surplus runs out, when that season runs out, then we send the pigs on a mystery tour, and they come back and into the freezer, and then we don't have any pigs until that runs again. So this philosophy can be mapped against obtaining yield and creatively use and respond to change. So we're looking at how the seasons change, and that bases how we manage the animal welfare and our social welfare and ecological welfare. The second one is understand climate change. And here we've got a little lightning bolt as a bit of a logo. This is important because even though everyone accepts that climate change is occurring, but from our philosophical point of view, it's important that we actually make a specific philosophy to understand climate change. And the impact of that is how we're going to manage and design our farm under different climate scenarios. So what we really did, we looked at how the farm is now and how we forecast it to be. Now, it seems that we will have more severe weather events. So I forecast a severe Mediterranean type climate system more so than now. And so we've looked at other Mediterranean bioregions and try to select those sort of plants to prepare for that scenario. So we've moved to grapes, we've moved to some olives. We want to put in some carobs and pistachios. Some of those tougher type plants, deep-rooted perennial plants to make sure they can get through times of drought much easier than an annual production system. And the other thing we've done here, we've put in these small swales, and they're designed to increase the soil moisture and allow that moisture to go down and keep the pasture alive. So we have different systems. We've got ecological systems where we've revegetated, and we've got pasture systems that are about farm production. So these swales are all about broadacre farm production. And so you can see there that the permaculture principles that they respond to would be creatively use and respond to change, use small and slow solutions, and design from patterns to detail. We're looking at the patterns of the seasons and the patterns of climate, and we're trying to estimate what detail we need to put into our management and our design. The third one we have is accept responsibility for decisions and the consequences. This to me is a really important one. It's all very good to put up your hand and say, yep, I did that. I made that decision. But you also need to put up your hand and say, I'm responsible for the consequences of that as well. We consider that we're top order predators in our ecosystem. And so as such, it's really important that we accept the consequences of our impact on that ecosystem. And the example I've got here is I'm collecting some frames of honey from one of our beehives. Now, we made the decision to say that we wanted some bees. That's it. But the consequence of that is we're introducing a feral animal into our ecosystem. Our bees are traveling around our ecosystem and consuming the honey and pollen that our native animals want as well. So there's competition there. So by taking understanding of the consequences of that, we planted 20,000 trees. So we're actually increasing and replacing the ecosystem resources that our farming's taking out. So from that, you can see we're self-regulated and we're accepting the feedback, our own feedback from our research and our feedback that the ecosystem is telling us. It also tells us that we need to manage our bees well so we don't have swarms. So we regularly put swarm boxes out in case we do catch one. If we don't catch a swarm, then that swarm will go and fill up a hollow in a tree that birds need for nests, or that some gliders need for nests as well. So we're looking at the pattern of how we impact on our environment, and we try and estimate the detail and the consequences so we can remediate any negative consequences. The next one we have is know that farming is not always about action. This is a really important ecological one for us as well, because what it says is it's not all about ego and testosterone. Sometimes you've got to stand back, sit back, and let the ecosystem do its own magic. And so a way of understanding this is by understanding that the more complex your system is, the simpler it is. Sounds a bit strange, but that's how it is. So we're trying to develop a very complex ecological system on our farm. And the more complexity we have in that, then the more that the system looks after itself. If something doesn't go quite right, there's fallbacks and checks and balances, and it comes good again. So we don't have to run around being the all-important human being in our ecosystem. Sometimes it's important to sit back and let ecological succession happen. The other way of looking at this too is that you can only do so much. And we found that over the years it's so critical. When we're working and we're getting tired, it's at the end of the day, if you push yourself to finish that job, well, that's when you have accidents. So from an OHS perspective, we just say, righto, that's it. I'm going to stop, and we'll knock off. We'll come back and do it tomorrow. Things like fencing, for instance. If you try and rush to finish the fence at the end of the day, that's when you tend to overstrain a wire or just have an accident, and it can be dangerous. So we just work within our own limitations. And so that's small and slow solutions. And again, we're designing from patterns to detail. We're looking at the pattern in our work process and the impact that has. The next one we have is appreciate the aesthetics. And again, this is another real important one to us. The best example we have, I think, is Elisa said, my wife, she said she wanted to have flowers in her market garden. She said, I want to work in a beautiful environment. And that's enough reason itself. But when I started thinking about the ecological impacts of that, it became quite profound. Because if you work in a beautiful environment, then you work harder, you work smarter, you work longer, because you just like being there. You're not concerning yourself with knocking off early, getting the job done quickly, shortcutting it. You just like being there. So you do a better job. And so there's a productivity outcome coming through there. We decided, well, we selected Waratahs and Proteas to be the main flowers that we were going to put in through the market garden. And what they do is they'll provide a microclimate. There'll be a windbreak and a bit of shade around them as well. And so there's a productivity gain there. Also, they provide an ecological niche for predatory wasps and other insects, which will then impact on any pests we might have in our market garden. So there's another productivity outcome. And another outcome that we get out of them is we can cut them and sell them at the market. We selected the Proteas and Waratahs mainly because they're a bit tougher. So we're appreciating our limitations. We don't have the skills in developing a really good flower business. We just wanted to select something that's tough that we can still provide some really nice, vibrant flowers to our customers at the markets. And that then also strengthens their connection with the farm as well. The other picture, or the picture we've got here, is what we see when we sit out the front of our house to have a cup of coffee, or we might sit out there on a Sunday and have breakfast. That's so important. We enjoy the aesthetic so much, and what it does, it rejuvenates us and recharges us and allows us to go back and keep working, because it's just such a nice place to live. So here we have obtaining an aesthetic yield with subsequent flow-on effect, and catch and store energy. So we're catching and storing this aesthetic yield is what I call it. It gives us all this energy to keep going and make things better. The next one we have is accept our limitations and appreciate our accomplishments. Another important one. It's very easy to dwell on the negative, saying, oh, I didn't do that right, and I haven't done that yet, and I haven't got enough money for this, and it's easy to do that. But here, this tells us we have to appreciate what we've done. And so the pictures I've got here, pictures from pretty much exactly the same spot. The top one shows what the farm was like when I bought it in 2000. There's 2 trees on the farm, and we've ripped that gully where we planted our woodlot that we flew over earlier on. And there's no other trees there. The photo below shows a photo I took in early April in 2023. Unfortunately, the 2 trees that were alive in the top photo, they've died because they were by themselves. They didn't have that ecosystem around them to support them. But you can start seeing thousands of trees that we've put in. You can even see some smaller trees that are still coming up. So you can't see much grass, much pasture, but it's there in amongst the trees. It really gives us a kick out of seeing this sort of change and the value that we know that we're having on the ecosystem. Part of this philosophy too is that we age with acceptance. And that's, again, slowing up and just accepting you can only do so much. So the limitations that age places on you, just go with it and put realistic expectations on your outcomes. So the permaculture principles there self-regulate and accept feedback and obtain a yield. This next one is one about respecting our forebearers and respecting local knowledge. It's another really important one, because we only know what we know because people have passed on the information. So even the European farmers that have managed this land for 200 years, they didn't have the advantage of knowing what we know. That they had a different thought process on how to farm, and they're driven by the economics more than other things. But we just appreciate the Wiradjuri people and what they've done to the country. The top picture there is what I call their thinking stump, and it's being propped up by a steel post. But I used to drive up the hill, and on that particular area, it's pretty steep. And I used to think I just need to push that stump over, cut it up, use it for firewood. It's ugly, it's dirty, it's untidy, and all those negative consequences. And I drove up there one day, and sitting on the very top of it was a superb fairy wren. And I thought to myself, you arrogant idiot. I really gave myself a dressing down, because I suddenly realised that all parts of the ecosystem are important and can be validated for all sorts of reasons. And so I finally stopped and had a look at that stump, and I've propped it up, and every time I take people around the farm to show them, I tell them the story of the thinking stump, and try to engender that respect for what's happened in the past. This philosophy is all about celebrating seasonality. We don't believe in the four seasons. That's a foreign construct that just doesn't make any relevance to where we live. We figure that we've got about 9 seasons. I keep adding more as we go on. And the thing about this is we don't have every season every year, and the length of seasons that we have changes every year. And some years, you don't have some seasons. So we use the concept of seasonality as a way of making management decisions of what we're going to do. It's a really intriguing way of operating. And so what we're really looking at is the patterns of the season. And the patterns of fluid, they're changing. And so the detail, how we approach the patterns, needs to be fluid as well. And from that, we look at the edges and value the marginal. As it's the edge from season to season is what tells us that that's the end of the frost, or that looks like the end of the rain. We're going into the hot, dry season. And so that allows us to value the different seasons as such. It's a really intriguing way of designing management processes. This next one is called Keep All the Links in the Chain. And when I was writing this, I was thinking about it, and I was actually thought, no, hang on, it's not really a chain, it's a mesh. So we need to keep all the links in the mesh. And that's a real ecological philosophy. And so the picture we've got here is some St. John's wort, which is a nasty sort of weed for us. But you can see that because we don't use sprays, you can see it's covered in St. John's wort beetles. And they're giving it a bit of a caning. So what we're trying to do is develop complex relationships. So that's again is where we want all the links, and we want them in a mesh, almost a ball mesh, really. And so the philosophies there, or the principles there, are use and value renewable resources and services, use and value diversity, and integrate rather than segregate, or models of keeping links in a chain. This next one's important too. Celebrate the natural state. We can't have an ecosystem if we don't have all the links in that, and we celebrate how all things happen. So here with a little anti-kindness running around, the opposite anti-kindness, and he used to come and see us when I was painting trees. He's only about 3 feet away. So yeah, so this is all about respecting the whole ecosystem. Again, we just consider ourselves a top order predator, and so we're only part of the system. So we need to celebrate the natural state for all the rest of the system. Here we have a part of our natural state. These are 2 separate goannas, and they're 80 metres apart down in our driveway. We went for a walk one day and we saw one, we took a photo, and we're so intrigued by it. It's so great to know that the ecosystem, the top order predators, are there doing their thing. And we started walking home. We got to the other end of the dam where there was another dead tree, and we saw the other one. And I couldn't believe that we had two big topwater predators within 80 metres of each other. It reflects well on how these philosophies and principles have impacted on the ecosystem of the farm, especially when you think of in 2000, there were no trees there. These dead trees were there, but there was no other trees. So there was very little habitat for birds' nests and things like that. Just a bit more of the natural habitat. And I don't think I need to say too much about this. Just a couple of videos we did of all sorts of things on the farm. And I suppose as part of the aesthetics is what we really want. We often see echidnas, and that one was just one up and around some wood. And the dung beetles were just going crazy one day, and I just thought, oh, look at that, it's just amazing. The next philosophy we're looking at is establish a succession plan. And here we've got lots of hands reaching in, working together. This is an important one to us because we don't want to waste our time. And I say that carefully, but if we don't establish a succession plan, what happens when we leave the earth? The farm gets sold. What if we don't have a succession plan? What are the new owners going to do? So we take it upon ourselves to develop our website and do presentations to try and encourage a succession plan for all farms. So this is really important. I'm going to be working on the farm for a few more years, but eventually I'll be gone. But the farm's going to be for thousands of years. So somehow we need to take this into account. And the permaculture principles that it relates to is produce no waste. You know, in some ways, if we sell the farm and a conventional person buys it and opens a can of chemical, then my life's work has basically been wasted. And so we want to integrate cultures and age groups into the farm. And we want to catch and store energy. What we're trying to do here is store intellectual energy that can be released in subsequent generations. This philosophy is a really good one. Sustainability begins. And basically, it begins with me. It begins with all of us individually. And so the whole farm is all about trying to be sustainable. And when I say sustainable, I mean forever. I don't mean sustaining the current system. I mean sustaining an ecosystem that's going to go forever. And an example of what this means for us is there is no such place as away. When you say you're going to throw something away, there is no such place. So we look at recycling our waste and taking responsibility for it. And that gives us a yield. And again, small and slow solutions. The photo here shows our straw bale house, which is made with recycled render, waste straw from a neighbouring farm, plantation timber, and we're all off grid. So sustainability is really important. The next one we have is allow life to exhibit its natural instincts. We can't develop an ecosystem without allowing parts of the ecosystem to exhibit their natural instincts. So we try and maintain family and social groups. We've got a chicken here teaching her young how to forage. So we try to breed our own chickens and develop that whole link of the chain. And that reflects back in our whole ecological management across the whole farm. We keep our sheep with the lambs and the cattle with the calves. We only take the heifer calves off when we're rejoining our cows, but we're trying to keep family groups together. So we look at the pattern of how our farm lives and works in a natural system and trying to manage the detail to maintain that. And that's, again, small and slow solutions. This chicken has not many chicks, but that's all right. We'll just have an extra chicken to breed more up. And so really you can see it's all about integrating, not segregating. Again, I can just emphasize it's about ecological management, not production management. The next one we have is we need to live within the farm's capacity. And this is, again, reflects back on our earlier one about welfare outcomes and economic outcomes. But our farm can only produce so much. Human hovel stood where Elisa is having a glass of wine enjoying the view, and they looked south there, and what they described was an English parkland. They described it as an English parkland, which basically means it was a grassy woodland. So our farm has the capacity to support a grassy woodland. It doesn't have the capacity to support a forest. So we're producing a food grassy woodland rather than a food forest. And that's an important aspect of what we're trying to do. So we're looking at the patterns of the landscape. We're looking at the patterns of the climate, the patterns of the soil, and the detail says we can only support a grassy woodland. And so the yield that we obtain from the farm is linked to the capacity of the farm. The next one we have is manage rather than control. It's all about keeping testosterone and estrogen and ego under check. By managing means you're part of the system. Controlling tends to mean that you're dominating the system. And so as a higher order predator within our ecosystem, we have no right to control. We have the responsibility to manage it. And a way of explaining that is looking at a cog system versus a bug system. Now, in a cog system, you have all these cogs and you wind a handle and you put a certain amount of input, and the input goes through all the cogs and spits out a productivity at the end, and that's it. You know the inputs, you know the outputs, and away you go. Trouble is, if you break a cog, the whole system falls down and you get nothing. In a bug system, an example of a bug system is where you might drop a crumb on the ground and an ant comes along to take that crumb to the ant nest. Now on the way, another ant will come and help, and they'll tussle and toss and turn and go backwards and forwards, and another ant will come and one will be on top and there will be one underneath, and there could be 6 ants taking this crumb to the ant's nest. If one of those ants leaves, dies or whatever, that crumb will still make it to the ant's nest. So we're trying to develop a bug system rather than a cog system. And we do that by looking at the patterns of the ecosystem and trying to maximize their impact. And so that also impacts on obtaining a yield and, again, using edges and valuing the marginal. So we need to manage rather than control. The last philosophy we have, we call it the rule of re. And that's all about renewing, revisiting, reconsider, reflect regularly. All the re words that can probably be summarized as reflecting on what we've done in the past. And part of that is where we rebuy. We rebuy our recycled plastic. It's taking responsibility for the consequences. We buy plastic, that's the decision. The consequence is we need to deal with it, and so we recycle it. But the bigger consequence is we need to take responsibility for that and rebuy recycled plastic product so that it's not just being dumped on someone else. And when we worked that out, that was some pretty serious feedback that we accepted. and we've self-regulated. So we're designing parts of the farm to cater for recycled plastic. So we've used recycled plastic posts in our vineyard, for instance. And so again, it also looks at use and value the renewables and respond to change. This is an evolving way of thinking. The way we keep tabs on how well we perform against our own philosophies is using ecological performance indicators. Most people heard of KPIs, key performance indicators. That's a business term, but here we've turned it into ecological performance indicators. And you can see we have a quintuple bottom line. We have economic outcomes, production, environmental outcomes, introspective outcomes, and social outcomes. And we look at our indicators and we try and measure them, and we put a target on what we're doing. It's all these are on our website. You can see them, and with different EPIs for each of our philosophies. What I want to do now is show how this impacts on our vineyard as a case study. And what I've done is I've kept with the permaculture principles, because that's what most people are more familiar with, so it'll make more sense. And what we have here is starting up our vineyard. We looked at our seasons and the value of the rain and the sun we were going to get. And so we decided we wanted to space our grapevines out much more. So we put them on a 3-metre grid. A lot of vineyards have grapevines every metre and have the rows about 2.5 metres apart. We've got a 3-metre grid. And we did that by putting this steel beam on the tractor. It's a 6-metre beam, and I just used that as a guide, and I ripped lines, and that's where we planted. The other thing we did was we spun our vineyard around, so our rows run northwest, southeast, and northeast, southwest. And you can see that on the view of the overhead view of the vineyard, where you can see the squares and they've been twisted around a little bit. This applies self-regulation. We're putting in less than half the grapevines that would be done conventionally, and it's going to impact on our yield, but will also impact on the longevity of our system. And so the feedback again was pretty tough. We just had to make those decisions. We're doing it ourselves, so we're using small and slow solutions, and it's just taking a lot of time to sort that out. But it's also where we've creatively used and responded to change. We've looked at climate change, and we figured this is a way of managing that. This slide's a little bit technical. I left all these calculations in for the people that do understand them. It doesn't matter if you don't. But what it shows is, if normally the rows run north-south, and if the rows runs north-south, then they're 3 metres apart. But by spinning them around, then the rows are almost on diagonals, and so it's over 4 metres difference. And what that does is, the sun comes up in the morning, having a bigger gap between the grapes means that they get more sunlight because they're not shading each other for as long. And that ends up being about 36 minutes a day. You can see from the bottom photo, you can see how it's a 3-metre grid, but you can see the diagonal of how much longer they are, an extra metre or so. The row, or the row of vines you can see in that bottom photograph, are running, it's north-south. So you can see that they're all the diagonals. So there we designed from patterns to detail. We looked at the pattern of the sun coming up and the detail of how much sunshine gets on the vines, and so stretched them out. And that allows us to capture and store more energy. When we design a vineyard, we've originally come up with Malbec, Zinfandel, and Mourvedre for a range of reasons. Half the the vineyard is Malbec. But instead of having 3 blocks, a block of each, what we've done is split them up. And we have a block here is just 3 rows. So what we've got is a row of Mourvedre, a row of Malbec, a row of Zinfandel, a row of Malbec, a row of Mourvedre, a row of Malbec, a row of Zinfandel, a row of Malbec, and so on. What that does, that integration, means that if the conditions are suitable for a sooty mold or some sort of fungus that's going to take the grapes, it'll attack a certain variety more than another because they grow at slightly different times. They set fruit at different times. And so by splitting them up, there's less chance of a pathogen going across a whole block of grapes. So we've integrated rather than segregated. And we've used the edges and valued the marginal by splitting them up and increasing diversity. That's one of the keys to ecological management. The green dots you can see there signify, the light green ones signify where we've planted acacias, and the dark green ones where we're planting fruit trees. And again there, we're trying to increase the edge. And the plan is there's 5 grapevines in acacia, 5 grapevines in a fruit tree, and so on across the farm in a fairly random approach. And what those support trees do, the acacias provide a lot of nitrogen because they're legumes, and that nitrogen will be harvested by poultry, and we'll run some sheep through the vineyard as well as it develops. And so our animals will harvest that nitrogen and deposit it in the root zone of the grapevines. They also provide habitat for predatory wasps and other insects and arachnids, and habitat for insectivorous birds. So that is quite an extensive increase in diversity of the farm. Now, to work out the edge effect, that 5 grapevines, 1 acacia, 5 grapevines, 1 fruit tree design means that throughout the vineyard we've got 17% of these support trees. And if each tree has a circumference of 6 metres, which isn't very big, that 480 support trees will give us an internal edge within the vineyard of 2.8 kilometres. The circumference of the vineyard's 846 metres, and that's all been revegetated. So that gives us a total edge of 3.7 kilometres within and around the vineyard to try and promote ecological succession and ecological parameters for the vineyard. So without trying too hard, we've managed to produce a lot of edge. Another thing about the vineyard that you may not have noticed is there's no wires. Again, that's part of our ecological decision. We've gone to what's an old-fashioned system called goblet pruning or head pruning, where they'll grow up to about 950 mil, and we'll prune them then and develop about 4 spurs coming off. This will reduce our yield, but what it does is it also reduces the embedded energy in the design of the farm. The other thing you can see is we've used recycled posts. These are second-hand vineyard posts, but in the background you can see some of our recycled plastic posts, which is part of taking responsibility for our plastic. So just in this simple one, you can see we've used invaluable renewables. Again, we're using small and slow solutions. We're producing no waste and creatively using and respond to change. The whole idea of having the vineyard is looking at climate change. So there we have our philosophy flower and the case study of our vineyard. And so I just wanted to say that at the end of the day, you can apply the philosophy flower to everything that you're doing and all the different enterprises. And so I'd like to think at the end of the day, instead of having a philosophy flower, you've got a bouquet of philosophy flowers. And that's the end of the presentation. And if there are any questions, put them in the chat, and I'll be sure to answer them. Thank you.